This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us once again the famous Dr. Buck Melton. Possibly, Buck, you're getting a little excited and tense with the election coming along. November the 3rd. Are you have any real estate plans to move or anything happening in your world?
I'm going to rough it out, whatever happens, but there are two swords there on the table, and America's going to choose which one it's going to fall upon. I suppose the Libertarians.
May I ask you a question? Who is the vice presidential candidate for Libertarians?
You're still trying to push me. So I guess there's an open door there. I can look into that. Have they had their convention yet?
I'm not sure, but there's certainly possibilities for you. Well, after our little journey into levity, maybe we can talk about something a little more serious, aka sin. Now, that's a big subject, isn't it? How would you define sin? Any thoughts? Sin and law? You're a lawyer?
Well, I do know that, who was the great legal mind that said, in heaven there will be no law and there will be nothing but love, and in hell there will be nothing but law and due process will be extended to the fullest degree.
That's pretty funny. Well, I mean, you want to kill this, but I think the idea is that we basically almost everywhere in the world, there is the notion of violating God's will or the divinity's will or some kind of external power that's above humans, and these laws have appeared, or regulations, or however you'd like to call it, whatever. The idea to make human contact more perfect. I guess that's a way to say it. And each culture does that. And then maybe some people would say, well, the law, human law, is based on divine law to some degree. The basic tenets of our legal system have their origins in maybe divine law. Is that an overstatement or comments?
Well, I suppose it depends on which system you're looking at. You did spring this one on me sort of cold tonight, so I have not pre-briefed
every
myself.
Good politician can
weasel out of it. So, of course, St. Thomas Aquinas has different categories of law. I believe the natural law, the divine law, the human law, and then there's one other level I can't remember, but yes, and of course he's drawing from Plato and the idea of the parable of the cave, so that anything human is essentially a reflection of a more transcendent ultimate reality. So in that sense, I think you could say, you're trying to pattern yourself after how God would do it.
Yeah, well, I think,
in the Judeo-Christian tradition.
Oh, good. I think we can, take that point out there. And the question is, as we, maybe we can move the concept or this discussion into our history, or the country's history. And so I guess the idea in the ancient Egyptians were, in their religious arrangements, if you were going to the next world, if you got to the good place, your soul was weighed against a feather. So if your soul weighed more than a feather, you went to the good place, and if it weighed less, you went to the bad place. So maybe discussing whether, assessing the country's history, how and when did the country sin or not? Maybe we can parse that out a little bit. It's going to be a little difficult, but...
Well, I think what you're tending to go at right now is, do a people sin, which I know you're very interested by the concept of blood guilt or collective responsibility. I'm not sure if I would buy into that. It seems to me that sin is not corporate but individual.
Good.
So,
I mean, I think we're in often agreement. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think people misconstrue societal guilt. And we can take our discussion into the past And I think what we get into is we inspect the country's history, whether or not sin occurred is maybe not so much, only at a distant level. I think you could say that. There's some kind of, in our contemporary morality, some religious basis to it, but a lot of it has been secularized, and our ethical arrangements are in many ways reflect somewhat of a broader viewpoint. And maybe Jeremy Bentham is tossed in there a little bit, different philosophical arrangements. And we have our present set of moral values, and which are a little indefinite, but applying those moral values, our present moral values, and going back 500 years in the past. So what is Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492.
October 1492.
October
Columbus
1492.
Yes.
Okay, so Columbus came, and there was no country here then, and we sort of talked a little bit about Columbus.
Well, you have to qualify that. I mean, there were certainly an Aztec country, an Inca country. These were fairly advanced civilizations. They just weren't European countries or European states.
All right, well, we'll take that. I mean, no European country is the better way to say that. There were tribal arrangements that existed in the New World, as they always have. So if we look at the journey from tribal arrangements to nation states, the tradition for the planet, for most of humanity's history, there were either small hunter-gatherer groups, and maybe tribes that got a little bigger. And then in the New World, we had a number of tribes. Some of them are quite dominant. Their behavior toward each other was based on an ethical system that is slightly alien to, I guess, what we presently have. Should we judge the Aztecs or the Incas on our contemporary set of ethics and say they were sinful?
Well, this is the perennial question that if you adopt the Whig progressive view of history, the idea that people are basically good and that we are always moving forward and being better than we were last year or last decade or last century, which is really the mindset of, I'd say, especially the Democratic Party today, most collectivist parties today, then your ancestors are always going to come up short by definition. You're always going to find something to condemn in the way it was done before.
What about humans in general? I mean, occasionally there might be, rarely, I would say that, there have been people that you could say, using our present ethical arrangements, their lives are pretty noble. You could say that particularly with, I guess, monks, nuns, priests, sometimes people that are very holy. You could make that case.
Well,
maybe there are an occasional person that's quite meritorious.
Well, I think you can certainly find tremendous examples of self-sacrifice all throughout history at just about any point in history. But the question is any one of these persons perfect without sin, to put it in the term that you've been investigating today?
Yes, well, I think sin's a useful word to study and think about. Well, I mean, I would, so we're racing along in our brief time here, but certainly tribal arrangements for most of humanity's existence have been difficult. Lots of struggle, lots of bad things happening, short, brutish lives, etc. Maybe just focusing a little bit on the establishment of America, European circumstances. So the first Europeans in the New World were actually the Portuguese, the Spanish, and then sundry other people started to turn up. And did they come out of a sense of goodness, I wonder? Were they trying to do anything particularly noble?
I would say for the most part, no, they were driven by basic human needs and basic human desires. And we'll even take religion as an example for that, since many of the English colonies were founded by religious dissenters. You of course were coming out of the wars of the Reformation in the 1500s and the 1600s, And a lot of what the dissident groups wanted was simply to be able to practice whatever faith they wanted. And so we'll take Puritan Massachusetts as an example, but that did not mean that the Puritans, when they arrived here and they saw themselves as being on a mission from God, they were certainly not prepared to extend religious tolerance to non-Puritans. They were in fact quite oppressive in that regard. So I could say, even in that sense, the religious groups were being selfish.
Well, yes, and you could, so what I'm sort of trying to say is that the world is just loaded with sin, and we could just speak exclusively about our country, but if we could, the intellectual journey could go for anywhere. It could go for China, could go for, I don't know, Sudan, could go for Ukraine. I mean, going back in history, people do what they need to, often just to survive, and in their desire to survive, they often injure other people, and they can be very evil, if you want to use that word, by putting their ego, their family before the general population, particularly people that don't look like them and may have some impediments, I would say.
Well, this is hardwired into human behavior, is it not? The reason that we're here today is because evolution and essentially selfish behavior to make sure we propagate, even if it's at the expense of some other tribe, some other species, or what have you.
Yes, you know, we could really just, it's easy to just get distracted from this subject. We could take it almost anywhere.
And I would, and I know you're headed someplace, but I would say that my personal definition of civilization is to what degree are we able to use our higher brain functions to keep our more base functions beaten down? To what degree can we be more selfless? I think that the more selfless you are as individuals and as a civilization, the more civilized you are.
And doesn't that, I mean, we're sort of getting into human behavior, governance, when people do bad things, our notion of sin. And then I think one thing we've sort of gotten into in the past is the mythology that underpins the country. So the idea is, in some ways, the U.S. is an exceptional place, pretty much if it is sinful, it's trying to correct it more than anywhere else. It's really religion. And people examining American history would say, well, it's just nothing but a series of wonderful gestures far past anywhere else. That would be one, I guess, viewpoint. Another one would be more suspicious and pointing out the many times failings that happened. So going past that point, I guess the Norman Lincoln Rockwell story about America is that almost as another chapter of the English Civil War, that people were against kings because kings had done wicked things and kept them away from religious truth and forced them into narrow circumstances. And then more or less imprisoned people against their best interests, doing his will, which had been corrupted. So the original arrangement would be, well, God is going to exercise his power through kings, and indeed kings will use that power in concert with religion to make the world a more godly place. So that would maybe the idea.
I suppose, although, I've never quite understood American antipathy towards kings because by the time the colonies were being founded, the English monarchy was fast losing power. And our real complaints, for instance, in the American Revolution, were really against Parliament. And now Jefferson's attack on the king in the Declaration of Independence, I think, was purely rhetorical. But we seem to have developed this antipathy towards kings. I suppose a lot of that might come out of the Reformation, that kingship was the symbol of government from above. And more and more, once you get to the Reformation and the idea of the responsibility of the individual believer, that what the individual really sought was self-determination. And that fits a lot better with the founding of America than the idea of hatred of kings. But
well, I mean,
be that as it
I'll
may.
submit one of the things that knocked the kings off was the coinage of the time. So I've often looked at these crowns with the picture of King George on them, who look like, I hope there are no kings out there listening, but like a first-class idiot. I mean, I've often wondered if you were like a backwoodsman, sort of a Daniel Boone kind of person who happened to get and the Revolutionary War was offering, and you actually looked at the coin and saw the guy in London that was holding himself up as your master. You know, it just is a terrible, terrible picture of a king. I'll let that go.
I don't know.
I
I'd have to think about
often
that one,
chuckle
but-
about that, about how unbecoming the portraits on the coinage were. I'll show you a crown at some point. Well, I guess sort of where we are on this is, you could say rejecting this divine right of kings, allowing for a personal conscience to take place, and sitting on a hill, almost I like to call this the fourth covenant, in a way, that you've come here, and if you really behave in a righteous way, all the cornucopia of earthly goods, power will drop into your tin cup. It'll be just paradisio. You can create paradisio here. It's a special privilege, and the privilege often comes, I think, out of the Parliament side in the Civil War, and also out of a lot of it, the Puritans, etc. What I'm going to say is that's the picture that's often been put out. But if you actually looked at the situation, the reality of the situation was more of the Virginia. I think New England had its ups and downs, and it is certainly, you alluded to this earlier, it is not a particularly great situation all the time. I could say that. And I would say what we get into is particularly the other colonies, the ones in the South, and in many places, people came for financial reasons, or their situation was just terrible in their home country. And the people that came here, although many people would like to pretend they're of aristocratic lineage, they came here. That was certainly the exception.
Well, there's no reason for an aristocrat to come from England to the New World.
Think about it. I mean, you're there, you're having fun, and you've got your big estate. You're drinking whatever you drink, drinking a lot of gin, gambling, having fun.
I'm not sure gin was the big drink until
1750, I think.
Really?
Gin
Okay.
Lane, yeah, 1750.
Okay.
I mean, I think that's when Hogarth did Gin Lane. I mean, gin, that's right. It appeared in the 18th century. If you went back to the 16th century, whatever you could drink. I'm saying if you were
I'm
really,
sorry. Yeah, that was
if
the
you're really
nitpick.
a wastrel, I mean, if you're a great aristocrat, you've got money, you never have to work, everything is great, you have a seat in Parliament, just life is wonderful. The people that were on the other side of the sheet, so to speak, they're the people that came, the Europeans, and it's always been the situation. So people came here. Maybe some occasional people came because they thought, well, I'm going to be able to practice my religion in peace and tolerance. But I would submit in general, it was an economic circumstance, and many of the people came as indentured servants. A huge percentage of people came, and there were a few people that were doing deals with the aristocracy that might get huge grants. They really wouldn't come. Well, we'll give you, I don't know, 2/3 of Virginia can be yours, and that's great. But I'm not. It's such a terrible trip, such a dangerous trip, crossing in this little boat. A ship is a better word. In a little ship, you're jammed in there. It's people die. You're seasick. The food's horrible. Storms happen. You're there.
It really is one of the worst oceans on earth.
It's
you don't realize it. So.
It's just a horrible experience, and no one is routinely going to come without great reason, nor are they going to easily return because it's such a hellish situation. So people wound up here for many times mercenary, selfish, ignoble in the sense, well, I just wanted 50 acres of land. I'd like to be, eat bread a lot. I'd like not to be a peasant. So huge numbers of people came, and coming under those circumstances, if you say that these are selfish motivations and not noble ones, you could make the case that the preponderant foundation of the country was based on selfish motivation. And if you look at the, if you look at our president, our president's moral compass, I'm not sure that's that acceptable, just to merely do something that's for selfish reasons. That certainly casts a different, I guess, patina to our arrangements. All right, people are here with selfish, so that was a bit sinful. And then, did they pollute the land? Did they cut trees down? I mean, they did a lot of bad, seemingly to the environment. Now, they were injuring the environment, we could say. Now, were they aware of that? They were injuring their environment.
That's a good question. I think we could spend an entire half hour on that one. You do have Jefferson, who I think they don't realize there's a bottom to the barrel. Thomas Jefferson, as late as 1800, says that there's enough land in America to last us even to the 1,000th generation. And 6 generations later, actually more like 5 generations later, Theodore Roosevelt is worried that we're in trouble and are going to run through of it.
I guess where I'm trying to sail the ship a little bit is sort of, if you're out there, firstly, you basically cannot read or write. Maybe you can or maybe you can't. You're worried about everything, but if you get enough money to buy a cow, that would be pretty good. If the cow overeats, that's too bad. I mean, the stream is polluted. It's just a secondary issue, and it would be very unusual.
Yeah,
so right. So just going through the whole nature of the country with our present ethical arrangements, it was quite quite sinful in a way, and for a couple of reasons. Do you think that people were knowingly wicked? I'll ask that question.
Well, speaking as a legal scholar, there are different gradations of wicked. So I think we'd have to pin it down a little bit more. And I hope I'm not sounding too Clinton-esque here about what the definition of is. But for instance, there's a big distinction in the law, which is ultimately, I think, based on Judeo-Christian principles of morality, in knowing something's bad and deliberately deciding to do it. Versus you should have known and you didn't. And then there are gradations in between. So
it's complicated.
We'd have to pin it down.
I mean, I guess you could say that many people were just really rascals in a way. I mean, their id was out there. They would, I don't know, do whatever they could to eat. They'd attack people, shoot people, rob people, do bad things, use bad language. I mean, many, many things they would do. And then another group of people had their own sort of religious arrangements, and they tried to adhere to some kind of religious code, particularly the Great Awakening, which was that Whitfield? Who was that?
Yes.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So many people were out there.
And Edwards.
Jonathan Edwards. So we've got all these things going on, and in general, when people were trying to act in a moral fashion, there's a lot of confusion about right and wrong, what's going on. Did they adhere to our contemporary ethical code about their behavior?
Well, once again, contemporary ethical code is a difficult one, and I'd like to take that in 2 directions. Well, first of all, I mean, even today, and probably Exhibit A would be Westboro Baptist Church, a group that militantly maintains its very strong Christian traditions, and yet preaching hatred of other individuals in the most offensive way possible. So I don't think you can just simply say, well, this person was professing a religious belief and attempting to live by it, and that by definition made them a good person. It could certainly make them a terrible hypocrite or somebody terribly ignorant.
There was a substantial, I mean, the complicated thing to go through the country's history, there's a very strong religious tent to the situation. But one of the things about this religious tent was that the Protestant viewpoint, they thought of the Catholic population as just terrible. And of course the pagans, the Indians, they were not covered by their ethical code in many ways. The Indians were creatures of Satan, you could say that, and the Catholic people were very looked down upon, and they were not allowed to vote. All kinds of things happened, and it was part of the religious wars in Europe were just transmitted here. And I'll make one other comment. One of the things is that, let's see, what's the Bede, I want to say...
Venerable Bede.
The Venerable Bede,
Yes, very
right?
good.
It's interesting to read his
History.
attacking,
History of the English Church.
attacking the Celtic viewpoints. I mean, they're obviously Christians, but he was just outraged. The Celtic, I guess Christians celebrated Easter at a different day. I mean, he was just outraged by that. So theological points, whatever, turn out to be of great consequence in these arrangements.
Oh, yes. Well, you have, during the Filioque controversy, a couple of hundred years before Bede, you had different Christian sects engaging in wholesale slaughter of each other over the question of whether God the Holy Spirit proceeded from God the Father or whether he proceeded from God the Father and God the Son. I mean, we don't even, even fairly educated people in matters of religion today have no idea what that means. It takes almost a religious specialist,
right?
And yet they're wholesale slaughter.
Well, that's right. So what I'm getting into is a lot of confusion on ethics. All kinds of things are happening, and the ethical codes that people lived by were a bit diverse, and they certainly didn't comport with, I guess, what we would say our contemporary code would be. Now, one thing of substantial consequence, I think, would be the Europeans, and we sort of touched on this a little bit, their treatment of Native Americans, people of different religions, but particularly their espousal of slavery, which is really, I'm going to quote Samuel Johnson. I mean, the people that were crying the loudest for liberty were the greatest drivers of Afro-Americans, and they were very, very wicked masters. And we could say, how did all that happen? And obviously it's a terrible situation as to how this occurred, and it is probably, well, it is. It's Fireball in the Night. It's the whole extraordinary, I guess, question for our country is how do we cope with this primordial sin? And I started out with sin, and it seems to be one of the, there are lots of sins, and we're going to weigh the country's soul against the feather family. But that's a big thing it's a big problem, isn't it? That's just understood.
And unfortunately, we're getting to the end of the half hour, so
okay.
I don't think we're able to.
We'll have to continue.
Unfathomable
we'll have to
problem,
continue on the subject. Well, I don't know. Do you have a final comment, Bucky, as we proceed along with
Just
this?
that I think that this one's going to take a lot more unwrapping before we get to the
All
bottom.
right. Well, good. It's good to see you here tonight.
Thank you.
I wish you well with your political aspirations, such as they be, and
Libertarians.
I hope that something positive will happen in your life quite soon.
Oh, we'll see.
I hope so. Yes.
Well, thank you, sir.
All right. Thank you.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.